By 1978, the pirate radio operators had become a significant problem for RTE. What had existed as an irritation was now becoming an epidemic. All over the country, illegal operators were popping up. Radio Éireann was increasingly feeling the threat to its revenues and its audience.
That was the mindset at the time, that we were the public service broadcaster, and if public service broadcasting was damaged, it would be a bad thing for Ireland.
So I think they got the shock of their lives, to be honest, when all these pirate stations and these little upstarts arrived. And I don't think they took them seriously for a long, long time.
We certainly had a superiority complex because we thought we were better than the pirates, particularly because we talk radio, and talk radio was very good at the time, and we had very good programming and very good presenters.
We didn't have the experience that they would have, and they knew what the story was. They knew they could put radio shows together with their eyes closed, and sometimes they did. You know what I mean? So
RTE was kind of confused about this, because an awful lot of the people who were state broadcasters per se, I mean many of them on staff, people like myself who were freelancers, were all listening to these stations because Radio Éireann per se, RTE Radio 1 as it is now, wasn't giving us what we wanted to hear.
RTE's initial plan to thwart the pirates was to launch a Dublin-only radio station. But late in the day, the plan changed entirely. The staff for the new venture was to come from within, and ironically from the pirates themselves. In a rather unorthodox recruitment campaign, aspiring broadcasters were given a telephone number to call.
You'd ring up RTE and somebody would answer and they'd say, "Are you in the Pirates?" And you'd say, "Yes." "Well, here is your time, at 8:15 Tuesday evening. Bring 3 records and we'll see you then."
I'd applied to RTE anyway, and I'd been turned down a million times because, you know, too fat, too slim, too tall, whatever, it doesn't matter. There was always a reason.
I immediately applied for it. I didn't get it.
There could only have been 9-10 places, maybe. I don't know how many there were. Because already within the building, you had Vincent Handley, you had Jimmy Greeley, you had Larry, so therefore Ken Stewart. You had a number of people who already existed within the building. So for the rest of us, we were all coming in as newbies. Actually, we hadn't a clue.
So there was this appalling vista that the hordes were going to be allowed in through the gates of RTE, that Montrose would be vanquished by the arrival of these people. But at the same time, an appetite for it. It was a curious dichotomy in opinion, and yet they knew that they had to have a legal alternative if they wanted to start raiding the pirates and shutting them down and depriving the younger listener of what they wanted to hear.
By April 1979, the new station was almost ready to go. Radio 2, as it was going to be called, would be coming at you on the 31st of May.
Coming at you, when I think of that slogan, we all hated it at the time. We thought it was like too smart. But when I look back on it now, I mean, if that was invented today, that would be regarded as a terrific slogan for a new arrival in any market.
I don't know who actually came up with that, because even in the build-up to it, we heard this word. It didn't even exist. It was almost like your uncle putting a hanky on his head, putting a 4 knots on it and saying, "Yes, I'm walking to the dance floor and dancing." That's what it was like.
There was great excitement, a great buzz in the place that this new station was starting, and we all worked like nobody's business to get it off the ground.
I was recruited to do a number of programmes on it because its ambition at the time was not simply to be a music channel.
As Radio 2 developed an almost instantaneous following, the newcomers were learning what it was like to become a household name overnight.
But certainly the sense of excitement and fun that, you know, goes with that, autographs or photographs. And the other thing, of course, was that a lot of fellas lived off these receptions. You know, somebody would be releasing a record, and I know at least 2 or 3 presenters and producers who would say, "I actually don't need to spend any money on food this week because I'll be down below quaffing away and eating whoever is going to pay for it, record label or whatever." So they took full advantage of the music industry and broadcasting.
Another group hoping to take advantage of the new station was the Irish music industry.
The music industry at that time was definitely showband territory. And they were going, yippee-yi-yay, we have now got a station that will play our records. And I subsequently found out how strong of an influence they were much later.
The expectation was that suddenly we're going to have an opportunity to get our Irish records out there. And once I was plugging something and said this is an Irish record, it immediately created a second-class citizen status. But it got to the stage where you would go and you'd be a lot more honest with the guys and you'd say, I really don't think I don't think it's a great record, but it might sit for a few plays in your program. It might sit okay there. And generally, I found there was a reasonably decent reception to that.
But for many of the new intake, the rigidity of RTE, something they'd never known before, was proving a bit much.
For people who came in from the pirate stations particularly, they would have found the management structure rather difficult unless they had worked in the civil service.
There's no doubt about it in my recollection that, yeah, you would be pulled up for certain things, but you wouldn't be out there. I don't think you did anything that was going to be particularly rebellious.
I presume the pirate station was a fun environment. I don't think Radio 2, as we called it then, was ever really a fun environment. I mean, we tried to make it so, but it was very strictly governed.
There would have been, you know, that sense from across the corridor that you're not really broadcasting. You're really just playing a few records, aren't you?
They were caught into a civil service on the air. That is RTE, you can't change it. It was not very exciting, but I wouldn't be critical of the people who worked there. That was because that was the world they came from.
We wanted to give away a bike and we had to write to the head of corporate affairs at the time and ask him if it was okay to do this because there was this new rule in, and we wrote to him and we didn't hear back. So about 2 weeks later we gave away the bike, and then about 3 weeks later we got a letter to say, yeah, you can go ahead with that. Classic.
One Radio 2 presenter in particular developed an instant rapport with the audience.
I thought Vincent Hanley was incredible. He was a showman. The thing about Vincent was that Vincent came ready-made. Ta-da!
He was like no one else that I've ever met. He was ahead of his time. He was obviously out there without being out.
He was just very, very special. He was the original DJ, the original superstar.
He'd look upon 2FM as being, as he put it, a disco run by a priest or a local disco run by a priest. It needs to be changed dramatically and radically and all that. And he was very flamboyant and man about town and that. He was just that bit different. I mean, he had a moustache, which is the minus point, completely. But apart from that, he was great.
We hand you back now to Dublin and Ireland's #1 disc jockey, Ray Dawkins!
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Vincent Hanley. I'll smack his bottom when he comes home.
Radio 2 was able to boast a stellar lineup of presenters right across the day and on-air features which caught the public's imagination.
We were trying to find a quiz, and we wanted a quiz that was slick, you know, wouldn't take too long.
What about a quiz with simple questions that is against the clock?
The result, the Just a Minute quiz, remains one of the longest-running radio features in the world. And despite its simplicity, it's yielded the most extraordinary answers over the years.
Where's the Taj Mahal? Occidental Hospital. That's true. Where's the Great Wall? Crumlin. What star do travellers follow? Joe Dolan.
If you get naught in the Just a Minute quiz, Larry makes you feel all right.
They didn't suit you, no?
By the end of the 1970s, RTE had every reason to feel proud of itself. The organisation's flagship Radio 1 was the voice of the nation, and its new pop channel was a runaway success. What could possibly go wrong?
Radio 2's problem was that it wasn't urban, but more than that, it didn't fully connect with its audience. And there was a need for a radio station that really did connect with its audience. And it took two buccaneers from outside of this country to do that.
Summer 1980, Radio 2 had been on the air for over a year. Despite its monopoly as the national pop channel, all was not well at the station.
I thought that there was an internal
thing going on. There was people from Dublin who would be DJs, maybe like Declan Meehan, maybe like Dave Fanning, maybe like Jerry Ryan, maybe like Marty, maybe like myself, who had an opinion about perhaps how the thing should be going. And I always got the sense that our opinions, whether they were shared or whether they were agreed with, they weren't going to change. You know, this is what they wanted. This is the radio station they wanted, and they wanted to appeal to the urban. They wanted to appeal to the rural as well. That's a difficult job to do, but at that time they felt they could do it.
The station was also committed to minority programming within its schedule and a substantial Irish music content. All very worthy, but unpopular with large segments of the audience.
It is very difficult with a music station like Radio 2 was to be all things to all people.
I think Ireland was beginning to change a little bit, and we weren't moving quite along with that. It was still, we must have an Irish language programme. We must have a programme like Toss the Feathers. Now, Toss the Feathers was a traditional music programme, lovely programme, but it really didn't fit on 2FM.
The pirate operators had seen the commercial potential in Dublin, in particular, and there were guys who were looking at it from the outside and saw that this was a place where they could really make some money.
This contradiction in the Radio 2 schedule opened up an even wider gap in the market for pure pop stations, and some professional operators were beginning to see the opportunity.
Once Nova and Sunshine came, the landscape changed.
And 539 Sunshine. Sunshine, run by veteran English DJ Robbie Robinson, also known as Robbie Dale, which operated from the Sands Hotel in Dublin's Portmarnock, soon attracted a huge local listenership with its mix of pop, chat and lively DJs. And it attracted top disc jockeys like Declan Meehan, recently departed from Radio 2.
The Tuesday show, Declan Meehan with you for the next 4 hours. Thank you to Martin for the last 4. 5.5 minutes past 2, that's Claire, and these are Rocky Sharp.
This was the first super pirate. This was a radio station which had jingles. This was a radio station which had jingles for their disc jockeys as well as for the station itself.
Mike Hogan, Stevie Dunn.
Sunshine Radio was the first with Robbie Robinson, and he had a much more sophisticated sense of what the potential was in terms of making money out of radio in Ireland. And he set the bar much higher, and there was a slicker operation, and there was much more of an understanding of the international context of radio.
But within 9 months, its newfound popularity was dwarfed by the arrival of a new super pirate, run by one of Robbie Dale's old colleagues, Chris Carey.
All Music Radio NOVA is Stereo 102.7 and 738 AM on a great Wednesday morning. I'm Colin Hayes, in for the next couple of hours from the movie The Beverly Hills.
I don't think that Robbie had the same vision, and I don't think that he had the same knowledge, if you like, that Chris Carey brought to the table when Nova was launched.
He had suggested to Robbie that his AM station goes on to FM. Robbie said, no one listens to FM. Chris said, they do. They do in America. If they do in America, they will eventually in Ireland. And I have got the mother of all FM transmitters, and I'm importing it into Dublin.
Radio Nova.
I had a telephone call from Tony Allen telling me, darling, I'm coming back home and we're going to be setting up Radio Nova. And he said, you know, Chris is starting a new station. And I was going, okay, this is going to be trouble. This is going to be bad for Radio 2.
Playing your favorites, Carter-free Radio Nova.
It was Radio Nova's sound which was so different.
And this thundering, magnificent, crystal clear, compressed, beautiful audio quality FM signal came through, and we'd no idea what it was until we heard this French jingle which sang Radio Nova, c'est la musique pour toi. What's that all about?
Radio Nova, c'est la musique pour toi.
Wow, this is new. This is a game changer. It's all going to change. And indeed it did.
It jumped out of the radio. It was pristine, it was crystal clear, it was loads of music, it was very impressive, and we all wanted to work there.
The moment I heard it, it was special. The sound was so rich. I was hearing music for the very first time, along the lines of the way I heard it on my stereo at home. And it just blew me away.
It became the outlet for new music. Everyone wanted to hear it. There were hundreds of thousands listening, and you could break new music acts. It's similar to what YouTube does now. We were doing that back in Nova.
Broadcasting from Dublin City on 8:46 AM and 88 FM in stereo, this is Radio Nova, where the time is 5 o'clock.
Nova News, I'm Brian Dobson.
It was just on a different level. It was my first experience, if you like, of what I would regard as a professional broadcasting outfit.
And the music they played was great, and they had a thing that says Nova plays the best music, and everybody believed that because it was true.
Suddenly, Radio Nova was cool and Sunshine wasn't.
Radio Nova.
It's 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 13th of June. The news with Sybil Fennell and Bob Gallico. Good afternoon.
To be honest with you, it really was the halcyon days of pirate commercial radio in Dublin. We had a fantastic location on Herbert Street. We had a great studio. We had a great team of people around the place. This was a radio station which was professionally run, paid its VAT, PAYE, PRSI, everything. And it sounded it on air.
It was all one big great adventure, and the idea that you could take audience off RTE was really energising.
It was like a family, and it was just one laugh after another.
Chris Carey was a complex individual, but someone who knew the radio industry inside out.
Chris Carey was probably the best radio entrepreneur that we saw in the pirate radio days.
He was visionary. He certainly saw an opportunity for an alternative to RTE in Irish radio.
And he had a capacity to identify really good talent.
A charismatic guy, flaky, but he certainly had ideas. He was really into radio for its own sake.
Chris Carey, Radio Nova.
It's 9:25 on the station that plays all your favourites.
He was a handful. He was crazy. He was megalomaniac. He was inspiring. He was everything. And you didn't know on a day-to-day basis which Chris Carey was going to walk in. He was such a complicated man.
He could be erratic to work for. He could be certainly highly unpredictable.
Mercurial, scary, unpredictable. I avoided him as much as I could because I was a bit scared of him.
People have lots of stories, and it happened to me as well, of being fired one day and rehired the next, and that happened.
While a lot of people didn't like him, he made an indelible mark on radio, on commercial radio, on music radio in this country.
By mid-1982, Nova was the biggest radio game in town.
We were convinced that we had an excellent listenership, but it came time to prove it. And so we decided to commission Lansdowne market research, and the results were just mind-blowingly successful and hugely disappointing for RTE, because they couldn't argue with the fact that a well-regarded, highly respected company had delivered these damning results, which of course caused havoc.
Nova was a runaway commercial success.
Clearly, it was successful. Like, our listenership dropped by probably realistically 60%. Effectively, our days were over. It was just a matter of time.
Radio Nova.
But not everyone took such a pragmatic approach. Over at RTE, the attitude to Nova and the other super pirates ranged from hatred to the downright bizarre.
Tony Fenton invited me to his 21st in Sunshine, and I was seen and I was reported, and I was called in and told, you shouldn't be singing these parts. I said, what? I believe you were at that 21st. I said, yeah, Ian Dempsey asked me to go with them. And he said, you shouldn't be singing that. I thought, you're working for the national broadcast. But people like that.
Anything that represented a challenge to their, hegemony was to be resisted. and things were resisted, publicly in one way, and they were also resisted in the background in a different way.
Well, I mean, I was at a meeting in RTE, and Robbie Irwin, who was, one of the senior producers, he said, well, they say in their jingles, Nova plays the best music. And the reason they say that is because they do play the best music.
I voiced the opinion here in RTE that they were doing it better. The sound of the station was better, it was warmer, the music they played was different, it was the music that people wanted to hear. Their jingles were different, their jingles were better. And it was taken an absolute, what is he expressing this opinion for?
They nearly threw him out of the building. They nearly told him, to take all his stuff and go. Big rows, and how dare you say that about our great, hallowed, kind of Donnybrook radio station. But he was absolutely right.
They were better, and everybody knows they were better. I was the one who said it, and I was the one who never went up the ladder in management.
We heard that story about the famous playlist meeting in RTE Radio 2. Well, we found it very humorous at the time. It was very funny, but it was also extremely true. This is where radio was at.
I really think they were in denial, and they were in denial for a long, long time. And they were probably in denial up to when Radio Nova closed down.
And Nova's close down was to come sooner than anyone could have imagined.
It is inevitable, it is natural, when any business faces competition that's going to take revenue away from them, that they're not going to like it, and they're going to do everything in their power to stop it. Human nature.
They were so obviously successful that it was a source of embarrassment to the government of the day, to the Department of Communications, and obviously to RTE as the state broadcaster.
I don't know the full backstory, but my presumption is that cozying up to RTE was good politics for a government party.
Whatever phone calls they were making, they must have had some class of an influence up through government to say, you need to act through the P&T and go in ruthlessly and close the big boys down.
On the morning of the 18th of May 1983, the government, egged on by RTE, arrived at the Nova premises to close the station down.
In comes the Gardaí down the stairs with the department, and they said, where's Chris Carey? And this was breakfast time, but 9:15, and I said, well, he's probably in bed, he stays up late. We're going to close down the radio station, we want Chris Carey, and we need to go to the transmitter.
Nova's transmitters were located in Rathfarnham in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains. For station manager Mike Hogan, it was a race against time.
I headed up with Dave Harvey, and it was a pretty hairy ride, because genuinely my biggest worry was for the safety of the P&T personnel. They had no real concept of what it was they were going to encounter when they got there, which was genuinely my real problem, because I could see some guy with the bolt cutters saying to himself, well, I'll switch this thing off, I'll climb up on the top of the porta-cab and I'll get the bolt cutters and I'll cut the wire, and that'll be the end of that. If he went anywhere near that 50 kilowatts of power that was coming out of that insulator and that shunt feed up to the area, he was dead. I mean, dead.
There were no casualties, but as soon as Nova closed, a plan was hatched to come back on the air and say goodbye.
Chris was fairly perturbed and annoyed that they were closing us down, and he was very much a man, it'll be on my terms. So I think after much discussion, a decision was reached that they would get a low-powered transmitter, go back on the air and announce to their audience that finally we will close down our radio station on our own behalf and on our terms.
You're listening to Radio Nova, broadcasting on 819 kilohertz in the medium wave band and on 88 FM in stereo. The time is now 6 o'clock, and right now we want you to blow your horns, wherever you are, and make noise.
The so-called close down was not the end. Radio Nova was back up and running and as popular as ever just 2 weeks later. preeminent in the listenership stakes nationally. Its flagship programme, The Gay Byrne Show, was growing audience year on year, and one item was to illustrate the unique connection the show had forged with the Irish audience. A teenage girl, Anne Lovett, had died while giving birth in a grotto in the Midlands town of Granard, and the shocking details were published on the front of a Sunday newspaper.
This story came up over a weekend.
I never meant to call you any sorrow.
And I think on the Tuesday or Wednesday, John said to Kevin O'Connor, who was with us at that time, why don't you go up to Granard and see what that story is about?
He went down, met an awful lot of people down there, came back the following day and did a broadcast on the Gay Byrne Show in which he told it in quite extraordinary terms.
And in a very measured, in a very quiet, in a very structured, and in quite a careful way, he gave an account of what he had encountered in Granard the day before.
As a result, we got an avalanche of letters from people from all over the country. Women who had had experiences not dissimilar to that which Anne Lovett had, of having at a very early age gotten pregnant, gotten into all kinds of trouble, had babies or lost babies as the case may be, or some had abortions, and had lived through the horror of that in silence for so many years.
If you want to know what it's about, let me tell you what it's about. This is my story.
We were all shocked at the brutality of her experience, but at the same time, we weren't all that surprised.
People in authority were being asked questions that they hadn't been asked before, but they were being asked them in circumstances where they were expected to answer them. And they weren't being asked across the floor of the Dáil. They were being asked in your living room.
It was the fact that this was exposed in the way it was exposed by Gay Byrne had such a huge impact in moving our society forward to say, we can't go on like this.
In many ways, what the Gay Byrne Show became was a lever which people could use on their families, on their communities, on the Gardaí, on government, on church, all of the people whom they might have seen influencing, affecting, or if they were oppressing their lives. And that opportunity to have a public place in which you could state your fears, state your anger, and state your case was a hugely, hugely important thing.
Despite RTE's efforts to rid themselves of the pirates, the stations had become an accepted part of the national media landscape. But by the late 1980s, it was clear that something would have to be done about the continuing unregulated environment. In 1988, after years of uncertainty, the government finally moved to sort things out.
The broadcasting legislation, which had been in gestation, if you like, through the 1980s, finally came to pass.
At last, commercial radio was on the way. Like the launch of Radio 2 a decade earlier, a new dawn full of new hope and huge opportunities. What could possibly go wrong? By 1989, the newly established Independent Radio and Television Commission had begun to licence commercial radio. Despite their track records, enthusiasm and a determination to get it right, things were not to be plain sailing for the former pirates heading up the new stations.
Stations had made projections for listenership, which by and large they were achieving. The cost structures were different, the cost structures were much higher, and I think that was a challenge for quite a number of the stations in the first couple of years.
At Capital Radio in Dublin, the country's first independent station, things got off to a rocky start.
Welcome to the sound of the capital. Capital Radio 104.4 FM.
We got on the air in July. The licence was awarded in February. As the late Jim Aiken, who was chairman of the company, said at the time, we were in a race with nobody but ourselves.
We were still operating in a mindset where there were 14 or 15 competitors on the dial, when in fact there weren't. There were only 2. We were first up, but we weren't best dressed.
Dennis O'Brien's station did not come on the air until November of that year.
O'Brien's consortium had spent significant money applying unsuccessfully for the national licence, so there was a great sense of excitement when they won their franchise.
I was down the country with my father, doing a bit of work with him, and we got a message from somebody to say, "You've won the licence." So beetled back to Dublin, and it was just one of those great days.
O'Brien and his team decided to hold off their launch until they established their formula.
I think Dennis had that right, because they did sophisticated market research.
We decided we'd use Australian and American ways of actually checking out what the audience really wants. So we did this very big research study of Dublin. Then about listening habits, and then we did music as well, a lot of music research.
Went back to the IRTC, which was the BAI of the day, with an alternative proposal on how they might do the music end of it particularly, which was accepted.
They certainly researched the market very thoroughly before they came on, and the format worked. I think giving themselves that bit of extra time also ensured that from a cost perspective, it was more successful at an earlier stage.
What O'Brien had gone for was the 25 to 44s, 25 to 54s, people with disposable income, and he was an instant hit. The money started rolling in and the market share went through the roof.
Really is a bit of luck in having the right people and the right plan to actually build an audience quickly.
Every other radio station in the state sat back, looked at what this guy had done and said, bloody hell, he's got a formula, it works.
In the southeast, WLR already had an audience. The challenge for Des Whelan and his team was the transition from piracy to legality.
We got our licence in April '88, and we were on air then by that September. It was a shock to the system, I have to say. It was very different to what I expected, and yeah, it took a couple of years to get it right.
While news stations all over the country were having teething issues, they were nothing to the problems which were to beset the new independent national station, Century Radio.
Good morning, everybody. This is Century Radio. It's Marty with the Breakfast Crew. We're all set.
From the start, Century's noble ambitions fell far short of its capabilities.
I think one of the major drawbacks for the news station was that it didn't have enough broadcasting managerial talent.
Unfortunately, what it did also have were people who didn't understand Ireland, who had come from elsewhere, namely the UK or wherever, and didn't really give us the kudos to say, you might actually know your own country and what you need to do. And I think there was a bit of that.
Nobody really understood radio at that level, and I think that was a big problem.
They didn't manage. They managed their own lunches. They didn't manage us. They didn't know what we were supposed to be about, because they thought that whatever would be right in Leeds or Bradford was going to be right for Ireland. Wrong.
There were also promises made in Century's application which failed to materialise.
Gay Byrne was certainly put forward as the person who would be part of the Century lineup when they came on air.
Century's founder, Oliver Barry, had approached Byrne about heading the lineup, which also included Terry Wogan.
He came to our home in Howth one Saturday afternoon and he put down a draft, not a cheque, a draft for €1 million. £1 million pounds? €1 million, €1 million, whatever. Whichever it was $1 million.
But it wasn't enough to lure him to the fledgling station.
And I rang him and said, no, I'm not going. And I think I was right in the long run, because it just never got off the ground. Now, there are many people who would say that it never got off the ground because I said no, but I don't believe that. I think it wouldn't have got off the ground anyway.
Another major problem for Century was transmission.
RTE controlled the transmission mechanisms.
They were never going to make life easy for a competitor, but they should have been forced to do so.
They had 3 transmitters on day one, Dublin, Cork, and something very minor in Limerick.
The signal was inadequate. You could get it, O'Connell Street in Limerick, but not in the side streets. The advertisers went crazy. This was not what they had been promised.
You had the most wonderful set of jingles as well. All over Ireland, it's on everywhere, from Stephen's Green all the way to Eyre Square. Well, you know something, it should have been, but the RTE guys made sure that it wasn't.
Certainly the Century people would have a view that RTE did not deliver the transmission.
But it was the interference of Communications Minister Ray Burke which was to prove the biggest problem for the station.
Century, when they had an issue, would go to the minister rather than to the regulator. And the relationship, it was a strange one. if the RTC wished to help Century, it didn't help that Century appeared to have that different relationship with the minister at the time. So I think that didn't help matters.
I picked up the Evening Herald one night and they said that the Minister for Communications was going to close down 2FM, and then I think he was going to do a show on Century and stuff, and I just went.
Burke's wading in to save Century with his level playing pitch only made matters worse and further deteriorated relations with RTE.
The whole Century Radio debacle, it was a threat in a number of respects. One, we were going to lose some of our top presenters, and there were rumours of gay going at one stage. Two, we were going to lose advertising. Three, we were going to be constrained with the amount of minutes of advertising that we could have in order to give Century Radio a leg up. And finally, there was a deep distrust of Ray Burke.
The station's finances deteriorated too. By mid-1991, the situation was critical.
I had found myself preparing a programme in the boardroom on one of my weekend programmes, and somebody had left behind a set of accounts from a board meeting. And being, the opportunist I am, because I have some accountancy training apart from being a lawyer, and I looked at the figures, and I thought they won't be able to pay the electric bill next week.
Century finally closed after just 2 years on air in November 1991.
I sometimes think that if the launch date of Century Radio had been put back by a month, and that the problems with the signal had been remedied, that the station might have survived.
Century Radio, when it closed down, had more listeners than any of the independent stations have now. Any of them.
And I still, to this day, all these years later, say that Century Radio should have survived, because it had a great base, it had a great listenership base, but it got its transmission wrong, and it got probably its cost base wrong as well.
There were now significant questions about the viability of a national independent station. But the nation's favourite and most enduring medium wasn't about to give up that easily.
Yeah. You know what? I like the players.
By the mid-1990s, local stations had begun to get into their stride. Despite reservations in some quarters, the Broadcasting Commission of Ireland, as the regulator was now known, advertised once again in 1995 for a national independent radio station, a successor to the ill-fated Century.
I think everyone understood that the failure of Century reflected the fact that there was a real challenge involved in establishing a station. But there was a determination, I think, among the board members that it was important to provide a national alternative to RTE, that it wasn't right that the national pitch should be left to RTE.
The answer? Radio Ireland.
I was approached by Brian Malloy and asked if I would like to invest in this radio station, and I was intrigued by that. Here was an opportunity. Intrigued, but knew the challenge. And I said, what role do you want from me? He said, would you be the chairman? I said, I will. And I said, but I'm really busy. I'm putting up a number of shows and I'm out on the road. And I said to him, how much time do you think that being a chairman will take up? And he said, a day a month, which was a lie.
Within months of going on air, the new franchise holder looked like it might follow its predecessor out of business. Radio Ireland failed to catch the listener's imagination. Its revenue and audience figures were dismal.
Every week we didn't know if we would have enough money to pay the wages. The newspaper headlines were Radio Direland, Radio 1%. And the board meetings were very tense because investors, including myself, were being asked to come forward with another round to keep the station alive.
With its back very firmly to the wall, Radio Ireland approached the regulator with a radical plan to overhaul its brand.
We decided collectively that we needed to change the brand. The brand Radio Ireland had been damaged and we weren't sure we could resurrect it.
Acutely aware of the implications of a refusal, the regulator was receptive.
The idea that a second service would collapse just was not appealing either to the board or indeed to myself. I was a very strong advocate, I would say, at board level of keeping Radio Ireland, or Today FM as it has become, going.
The transition to Today FM secured Radio Ireland's future, and the station hasn't looked back.
When Radio Ireland settled down to be the Today FM that it is, it established its own patterns and its own traditions, and then along came News Talk as a national channel, doing an entirely different thing and offering a really useful and valuable service.
Since 2006, News Talk has provided a national news and talk service. Personalities have remained at the core of its offering, and broadcasting expertise hasn't always been a prerequisite.
I said, well, what about some training, you know, something? It's very simple. When the red light goes on, start talking, and when it goes off, stop talking. And that's exactly what I've been doing ever since.
News Talk's growth has been fueled by presenters like Pat Kenny. His departure from RTE is probably the most high-profile validation of independent radio's coming of age.
I was delighted that the impact of my going was that the unbelievable for many people had happened. That if Pat Kenny thinks it's safe enough to throw himself into the shark-infested waters of the private sector, so be it.
100 years since the first radio transmission in Ireland, and radio is thriving. Over 40 licensed commercial stations broadcast 24 hours a day, all year round. Radio na Gaeltachta has operated for over 40 years, and community radio continues to flourish all over the country. The impact of all these stations is extraordinary.
In 1996, 89% of all adults in Ireland listened to the radio every day. 89%, it was phenomenal. 20 years later, with hundreds of TV channels, with breakfast radio on every one of them, we've got 83% of people still listen to the radio every day.
The bulk of radio that people listen to is Irish radio. The bulk of television that people have access to and watch is not Irish television. There is a striking difference in the relationship that people have. It is culturally relevant to the lives of people who live in Ireland.
In the southeast, WLR and Beat FM operate a local and regional service from a purpose-built facility in Waterford. The stations are intimately involved with their listeners, from cradle to grave, literally.
Death notices are a serious source of revenue for local radio stations. The reality of it is that down the country, people don't like to miss a funeral. From our point of view, when we started out, we more or less said, over our dead body, will we ever do them?
Despite the success of the new arrivals, the RTE stations continue to play a significant role in the marketplace, with huge audiences still listening to their output.
The fascinating thing about it is that they will still switch to RTE Radio for the news, for the main news, and for their main information programmes. They will listen, of course, to other programmes along the way, but they will always depend on the national radio station for certain things. And I don't see that changing in my time.
But with the proliferation of new methods of instant and online communication, what future, if any, does this century-old medium have?
If I was to say in one word what's happened over my lifetime, it would be fragmentation. In other words, you've moved from a monolith to every day, in every direction. You have new technologies, people, accessing media, social media, where and when they want. And I think that's just going to continue exponentially into the future.
I think that if radio is going to remain relevant in a time where it's confronted with a huge amount of material that people can access on their telephones, on their television sets, on their laptops or whatever, it really is going to have to offer something that is of value.
From the first broadcast in the GPO, through the war, the dreary 50s, the swinging 60s, the swashbuckling pirate days of the 70s and 80s, right through to the developed industry we have today, radio has been a constant companion to Irish people in all corners of the country. For 100 years, it has pioneered and informed, amused and entertained. It is a central part of Irish life, and nothing's going to change about that anytime soon.
Local radio in Ireland has been a huge success. People like listening to the world they live in, or listening to the world they live in being delivered to them.
I love the relaxation of radio and people's ability to be more themselves and not to be self-conscious all the time about how they look.
I think the radio sector, RTE and commercial radio, is a powerfully strong part of the media environment.
It's a wonderful medium, it's a very intimate medium, and it gets material around, you know, with great ease.
There's something very real and immediate and trustworthy, for want of a better word. If somebody's a nasty person, you know they're a nasty person pretty well quickly. If somebody's a divine person, you know it. If they're great gas, you know it. If they're having a hard time, you know it. If they're having a great, you get the voice, and it's that intimate connection that I think is radio's powerful strength.
And a quick mention to some comedy later here on B3 as Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi team up with Game of Thrones star Ewan Rayon. Make sure to catch Vicious. That's later at 10. Brilliant comedy. On the way after Doc Martin. That's next.